We're talking to Scott Crawford and Jan Huhelski. Uhelski. About the new Creem documentary. Scott is the director. Jan is the writer and and one of the producers. Could you give me some idea of the genesis of Boy Howdy, the Creem documentary?
Do you want to start?
I'll start.
Yeah.
The creation story?
Of the actual movie, or do you mean Boy Howdy, the icon?
Like how we decided to do a movie?
Yeah, the movie.
Okay.
I used to work with Scott as a senior editor at Heart Magazine for years, and he loved Creem, and he was always asking me, could you find out for me if we could do a documentary on Creem? I wasn't part of that he just wanted to do a documentary on Creem. And I happened to be in Detroit a few years back, like 5 or 6 years, and I was having dinner with Connie Kramer, Barry Kramer's widow, and J.J. Kramer's mother. And she said, J.J. would like to stop being a lawyer, come back to Detroit, and be his father. He'd like to pick up where Barry left off. And I said, no, he can't do that, but I have a solution. I have a friend who I work with who's just made a film. Why don't I put the two of them together and see what happens? So I put the two of them together and magic happened. They just got each other. And that was the first wheel that turned.
That's right. And then from there, it was just this process of getting to know one another, JJ and I, and then going out and just doing, just doing the work, doing the interviews. I don't know how many states we went to. We traveled across the country, probably 40, 50 interviews. Not all of them were on camera, but certainly spoke to a lot of people, did their research and things like that. It was about a 4-year process.
I think that one thing you realized from reading Creem was that the magazine's message, as you point out in the movie, was that these rock stars are like you and me.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
How do you think they reacted, to that sort of approach? Because so many of them project this larger-than-life image.
Well, don't forget, this was before big media. This is before corporate rock. This is when rock really was, if not in its infancy, in elementary school. And they weren't selling scads and scads of records. Platinum records didn't even exist then. They were happy to get the coverage. They really thought of us as their peers. I mean, we never thought we were less than the rock stars, not in an imperious, uppity way, but I think even today the best interviews are conducted when you talk to someone face to face, like you're having a conversation. So Rod Stewart would come to our offices and just come to a party, and they were happy to talk to us. It was like a rite of passage because everybody else, like Rolling Stone, kissed their ass, and we just didn't, and that was much more rock if you use it in that context.
Also, the Creem journalists tended to be more participatory. That's the only word I can think of.
Yeah, where do you think that started? Was that more of did that start with Lester, kind of inserting himself into the...
No, it was...
Who did that first?
I think he and I did it about the same time. George Plimpton had a book called Paper Tigers. George Plimpton an author went and decided to train with the Detroit Lions and see what it was like to actually be a football player. So he actually was on the field and he talked about the whole process. So I'd read that book, Lester had read that book, and we thought, it's pretty great if we just try to be them and see what that's like, and right from that point of view. Just because we were always high concept, we would do comics. Comics were a lot of meat and potatoes, because if we didn't know how to cover somebody, we didn't have an interview, we had a lot of photos, so we just write silly captions to them. But the participatory part really was coming out of that book, and it was also the time of new journalism in the 70s, and that was called me journalism. So you were as important to the story as who you were interviewing. Right. So it was like a zeitgeist thing.
I have a question for you, Scott. As someone who, Jen was there at the beginning, but you were coming to it, later on. What sort of approach did you bring when you put the movie together?
Well, I kind of lived vicariously through Dan and so many other writers that I'd worked with over the years when I was doing a magazine, and hearing their experiences at Creem. So I wanted to kind of, capture some of that magic that happened somehow on the screen, which is impossible to do. But I wanted to at least tell a lot of these stories that I'd been heard about for so many years, and that's why unfortunately a lot of the writers weren't had passed or weren't available to be interviewed. But I think having Dave Marsh and Jan and Sue Whitehall and Dave DiMartino had just getting their sense of what it was like helped me sort of create a stronger narrative.
One thing I do notice is that the movie does address, like, for example, the conflicts between Dave Marsh and Barry Creamer and Lester Bangs. How did you go about deciding what and what not to put into the movie?
Yeah, that was...
It was the do no harm paradigm. He didn't want their descendants to really feel exploited.
Yeah, so we had to... it was a little bit of a tap dance, or what's the word? I mean, you had to kind of tiptoe around a few things. But it was that combustible, I think, energy that those three had that kind of made Creem, at least part of what made Creem so great. Would you agree?
I think everyone cared so much,
right?
And we were all opinionated,
right?
And everyone wanted to do it their way, and everything really was about the artistic problems. It was never like, because we lived communally, it wasn't like, oh, we left the cap off the toothpaste. The fights were really about, I don't think Pink Floyd should be on the cover, right, because there's no distinct faces and no one will know who they are and it'll sell badly. And that was a Barry Creamer conflict, and he was right. So we learned from those moments of extreme strife. It happened all the time. Like, this is downplayed. We always would have cover meetings and we'd order ribs, checker barbecue, and ribs would get flung everywhere. It's like we should have learned, but there was just something ritualistic about how we worked.
One thing that the documentary does address is that a lot of female journalists got their start at Creem. And I know Lisa Robinson, for one, wrote for the magazine for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. When we were working on the film, I had read an interesting article that Ann Powers had written. I don't know if it was on Facebook or somewhere, but and I don't know if Creem was the only magazine that she said this about, but she talked about music magazines and kind of the sexism that existed within them, even now. But she specifically pointed to Creem, and I really wanted to address that in the film because I couldn't understand that because of the amount of women that worked at Creem. But I also, on the other hand, knew that some of the captioning and things like that were, I mean, they were sexist. I don't think anyone can argue that.
Right.
So I wanted to address that, and we addressed it head on, and I went straight to Ann Powers for the film to get her, and I think we did a pretty good job with that.
I do too. I think that it was funny because I think what comes across in the film is that if it was sexism, it's like, isn't there some Roger Rabbit quote? It's only a joke if it's funny. It's like we only used it if it was funny. It wasn't just pure exploitation. I mean, even those images of the naked girl with the boxing glove covering up parts, it was funny. It had a funny caption. So humor was important. Humor and sex went hand in hand, not sex and power like it usually is presented.
And I noticed also people like Flo and Eddie. Yeah. That was another example of, well, they were guys, but playing it for laughs.
Absolutely.
Most of it was, even B.B. Buell, who was exquisitely beautiful, the most beautiful woman of her time. And there she was with her little panties, but it was funny.
Right.
So,
I'm wondering, when you were interviewing the writers, what did you think it was like for them to sort of take that trip down memory lane, especially people who might have gone on to do so many other things with their careers? Did you ever find some who were reluctant to talk, or were they open?
There were several. Yeah, there were a couple that were definitely, and in fact, I think a few didn't even want to talk about it. Yeah. I mean, I can't get into specific names, but there were certainly people that just didn't want to talk about it. And I think that's the case when you're doing anything like this, where, especially when you're talking about an environment that was, like I said, so combustible. Some people can take it, some people can't, and a lot of people had simply just moved on, and they just didn't want to talk about it. And I think you find that a lot when you're making documentary films, where some people, you go back to the source, and they're like, I'm done with that part of my life. I've moved on. I don't have anything to say about it.
People are embarrassed. I know a couple of the people that we approached wanted to distance themselves so far to what they were, like it was their misspent youth. That association for their kids, that they were like big druggies, and seriously, that wasn't the case at all. But other people were still mad because, back to what Scott said about the combustible personalities, they still had grudges. I think after the film, J.J. Kramer said that people were still mad at his dad, and in dying, his dad got the last word. And they didn't even want to take that shot. I can't say that those were the best years of my life. They were like explosive and fruitful, and I understood life, but calm, never. I mean, I was a ball of anxiety, and we all were.
One thing I think is that the zines of the 80s sort of picked up where Creem left off. Would you agree with that?
I think that's yours.
I think so. I mean, that's certainly how I learned about Lester, was reading zines. And, there are a number of zines that I can remember specifically, like Touch and Go was one that I remember specifically. There was a writer named Tesco V, and it was his magazine. The magazine later became a record label, but and he wrote a lot like Lester, and that style I loved that style of writing, and that's really how I learned to write like that, or to understand that kind of humor. And then it was through reading him, and then other zines, and then I kept seeing Lester Bangs' name being thrown around. This is, of course, after he died, and so I went backwards, and I went back and discovered, Creem that way, because I didn't live it at the time, so I had to relive it, and it was an exciting thing to discover for me. It was like an encyclopedia of sorts, just for the 70s of what was going on in Detroit specifically. Yeah,
like old music.
Yeah, old music, and really gave me a sense of a new set of reference points musically, to then base my writing on, and base my my interest on.
And it seems as though a magazine like Creem could have only come out of somewhere like Detroit that was far from media centers like LA or New York. Do you think that's accurate?
I always have this theory about Detroit, because Detroit, we know that we're not sophisticated like the coasts. We know we'd like to be as important, so we try to mimic them. But the trouble with Detroit is, in mimicking them, we get it completely wrong. And in the wrongness, we find this genius. There's a gentleman.
We might have to pause for a second.